All right. Hello and welcome, everyone. We are live for assessing individuals and teams. My name is Todd Federman, and I'm the Managing Director of North Coast Ventures. For those of you not familiar with North Coast, we are based in Cleveland and made up of over 250 individual investors in 6 separate funds. These funds include both angel funds and more traditional venture capital funds. At North Coast, we feel that our strongest asset is the power of our network, and we rely very heavily on this network to help us connect to individuals and teams, and of course, to help us assess those individuals and teams. Over the past 10 plus years, we've evaluated thousands of startups and ultimately invested in 59 companies. For the many hundreds of companies that we took to later stage screening or full diligence, one of the most common reasons we did not move forward with them was team. A lack of comfort with the team, that they had the right stuff to be successful in a high growth environment. Shortly, we will explore why assessing people is so hard. We'll talk about what can go wrong and what kind of mistakes can be made, how assessing people and teams as a startup grows, and how it differs as you raise more capital. We'll also look at the makings of an A-team, the limitations of gut feelings, and the limitations of our own BS detectors. Lastly, we will look at the role of biases, conscious, unconscious, and cognitive biases. Before we get started, though, I'd like to thank PNC, our sponsor for this event, and our sponsor for the full 2020 Insight series. As many of you know, PNC has a strong commitment to economic development and the entrepreneurial community, so it's a natural for them to support events like this. Over the past several years, I've gotten to know Pat Pastore, PNC's regional president, as well as John Beer and Dave Leger, who lead PNC's wealth management and Hawthorne groups. Can't say enough about the support and partnership that they provided, and we are grateful that they are with us here tonight. With that said, I am going to share my screen and we will get started here in just a moment. So we are thrilled to have everyone with us tonight. In just a few minutes, I'm going to introduce the first of our 2 panels. The first panel will talk about how we assess people and teams at the pre-seed stage, which is an animal in and of itself. And then we'll talk about how we assess teams and individuals at Series A and beyond. So diving in, let's just acknowledge how hard the game we're playing is, how hard it is to launch a startup, to grow a startup, and for us as investors, how hard it is to evaluate startups. Let's also acknowledge just how hard it is to assess people. People who run startups are often naturally charismatic people. They often are optimists, which means that sometimes they tell themselves things and they tell us things, intentionally or unintentionally. But part of our job as investors is to evaluate them and to understand things that may not be immediately clear. Their integrity, the experience they have in a given space or industry, the deep expertise they may have or may not have with functional areas that are required to grow the businesses. And also their commitment to put in the time, energy to grow the company. Lastly, culture. Culture is important because it is what many of these entrepreneurs use to recruit, to attract people to their teams. So what could possibly go wrong if we get any of this sideways, right? The Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos example is a really interesting case study. This was a business where both the board and prospective investors thought there were hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue in the company, and it turns out there was less than 100,000. There are a lot of reasons why that happened. We talked about many of those several weeks ago on a board of directors workshop case study that we did. But for now, we'll just leave it at, even when there are good investors involved, smart people on a board of directors, it is an imperfect science to evaluate people. So let's go back to how hard of an endeavor this is. I think most people know intuitively that startups are often unsuccessful. At least 50% of them will fail. And in fact, 50 of them fail to get from the seed stage to the Series A stage. There are a number of reasons for this. Crunchbase has some very interesting data where they did a series of postmortems and asked the founders and their teams to indicate why companies failed. Interestingly, the 3rd most common rationale cited was not the right team. Well, as investors who support many of these teams, we don't love to see that, but for some of the reasons that we'll talk about, I think it's understandable why this answer was selected by almost a quarter of the respondents. We'll talk about the nuance of how evaluating people and their teams differs from stage to stage. We've talked about this type of continuum before. As companies grow, they can't all grow on the back of the founders. Management teams have to be in place. Leadership teams have to be put in place. On one hand, that takes some pressure off of the founder and CEO. On another, it puts an enormous amount of pressure on, because not only do they have to convince investors that their effort is worthy of capital, but they have to convince best-in-class leaders, whether they're developers, product people, marketers, you name it, to join their team, to take a risk, and to look for upside in the equity of the company. So we said it's all about the people. As an example, this is what a team can look like at the pre-seed stage. These are two of our entrepreneurs who founded Vlipsy when they were getting ready to walk into Techstars, an accelerator in Atlanta. This is what they looked like when they received funding from us. As companies progress down the continuum, this is Proformex after their seed raise, they're able to build out teams. The types of tricks that worked when you had 15 people or 20 people, as you see here, don't often work when you get to 100 people or 150 people. Managing these teams gets increasingly difficult. There are different challenges in terms of structures and processes that need to be in place. And when a company like OnShift, which you see here, transitions from 100 plus to 200 plus in a relatively short period of time, that creates a whole other level of process that has to be there in place. We'll hear from Mark Woodka a little bit later today, as well as John Ensign, who is president of MRI Software, which has well over 1,000 people. And I'm sure he'll introduce us to many of those additional challenges. So we all want to have an A team here, and tip of the hat to the decade of the 80s. But what is the makings of an A team? And one point I would make and tee up before we bring the panels in is that the founder or the CEO doesn't have to have all of these abilities themselves. It's partly why you build out a team. But clearly the vision has to be there, right? The insight to the industry and a reason for being for the company has to be there. The company needs to be able to build the product, to sell the product, to deliver the product and support the product. Those things are key not only to accessing the channels, to managing the infrastructure and the ecosystem that they're selling into, but also to make sure they're happy customers. All throughout, there's a need to recruit and to fundraise to support it. Knowing that most startups are not successful, and knowing that we want to evaluate the criteria for an A team, one of the things we'll talk about a little bit later is how you do that. The extent to which you can evaluate companies based on your intuition, your quick look, or as Malcolm Gladwell put it, blink, versus truly going a Moneyball route, where you're looking at all the factors, the data's, doing analysis, and trying to make a clear, coherent decision from a great deal of information. I'm not sure there's a right answer, but I look forward to hearing the discussion. We'll also talk about people's ability to have a bullshit detector, which although many of us have tried to hone that over many years, it's very difficult. Sometimes the very charisma that allows Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos to help compel people to join the startup, people to invest, also can blind us as investors and supporters to some of the challenges that exist with the company. There are a great deal of types of deceptions that can and do take place. We've listed several of them here, but we include this detail to show that they're not all sinister, and that it's really incumbent upon us as investors and managers who are in a hiring process, trying to evaluate people to get the story straight and to make sure that we ask not just the hard initial questions, but ask the follow-up questions. When you ask a question and say, what did you do in this situation? And someone says, well, generally in that situation, I do X. You don't want to know what they did generally. You want to know what they did in that particular situation. And listening for those exceptions is one of the ways that our detectors can be more finely honed. So talk a moment about bias, and this could be an event in and of itself. This is really what many people think about when they think of startup founders. And it turns out that young white males are often the stereotype, And it can often get in the way of what we see and see as possible, what we see as an opportunity. And these biases can, of course, be both intentional, and then they can also be unconscious. We try our very best to think through and be aware of as many of these biases as possible for many reasons, not the least of which, though, is that we want to be able to see the best companies and opportunities. We want to be able to understand which of these leaders is more likely to be successful. And we hope that by building a diverse team, both within our membership as investors and also within our portfolio companies, that we will increase the quality of the decision-making and increase our likelihood of being successful. An interesting area of study here, of course, is cognitive biases. There are a number of crutches that we all have, ways that we deviate from what we might otherwise think is rational decision-making. One I'll mention here specifically is survivorship, that many times the post-mortem analyses or the evaluations of what successful startups do comes only from evaluating successful startups. And that is just as problematic as evaluating the work of successful athletes and assuming that everyone who goes through those routines will be a successful world-class athlete. So again, up to us to be aware of these biases and manage them. Lastly, despite all of our best intentions, once you get in the ring, and in the well-known Mike Tyson quote, once you take your first punch in the mouth, the game changes. And we want to invest in people that have the type of characteristics where they will be committed, where they will be resilient, where they'll be able to work through the ambiguity and ultimately be successful when we know the plan on the ground has to change. So we're almost ready to dive into the first of our panels. Most of you have recognized we are in a webinar version of Zoom, not traditional Zoom, so everyone's cameras and audios are turned off. You do have the ability to ask questions throughout, though, through the Q&A feature. We will keep an eye on those, and presuming we have time with both panels, we will introduce a couple of questions from the group. So please do chime in. So with this, I will invite Candice, Charlie, and Marcy, our first three panelists, to join us. And I will ask that each of the three of them, starting with Candice, just give a brief introduction of yourselves. And we will start the questioning as soon as we hear from all three of you.
Awesome. I'm Candice Brackeen, General Partner at Lightship Capital. We are a fund located in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's a $50 million fund focused on companies in the Midwest, led by founders that are either BIPOC founders, LGBTQ founders, or those that are disabled. Oh, and women, of course. So those just typically overlooked with venture capital. We invest in consumer packaged goods and services, e-commerce, sustainability, healthcare, and AI.
Great. Hi, everybody. This is Charlie Lougheed. I know many of you. I'm a four-time entrepreneur. I don't know if that's good or bad, but do it nonetheless. My last two companies I co-founded sold to public firms, so had a great experience and interesting experience in that process. Most recently was Explorers that became IBM Watson Health. I've been involved with North Coast as a member since 2015 and as a portfolio CEO since last year. And today I serve as the CEO of Axuall. Axuall is a Cleveland-based startup that focuses on workforce intelligence, specifically in the healthcare market. We enable people to digitize and manage their authenticated career credentials and share them with employers and customers so they can essentially start work faster.
Hi, everyone. I'm Marcy Shankman, and I think I'm your wild card panelist, as I am brand new to this sector. My background is actually in higher education, and I have two interesting connections. One is that I actually started my own consulting practice. My focus is on leadership and organizational development, and I've been doing that for the better part of 25 years in a variety of ways, primarily in the nonprofit sector and in higher education. Although currently I serve as a leadership coach and strategist for the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. But I do find some connection with this conversation around startups, since I actually did start my own consulting practice. And that's been running for about 20 years now. My other connection to the topic and to many of you is I actually did my dissertation, and Todd, I don't think you know this, but my dissertation is actually on organizational creation and looking at what does it take to go from the seed of an idea into a fully functioning organization. And I studied that in the context of higher education. So I've had my toe in the water of higher ed since really since I was an undergraduate, and I am still there as an occasional lecturer and part-time professor.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Marcy, Candice, and Charlie. And Marcy, the credential you left off, of course, is that you were our fearless leader in leadership Cleveland and managed 70 some odd of us.
Correct.
Through the 2015 year, which was a lot of fun. Candice, let's start with you. So you have been involved not just at this venture level where you are today, but also the accelerator level, which is just about as early as you can get involved with a startup. Lots of big, bold ideas. How do you go about evaluating startups when they're so early?
So for us, so I started Hillman Accelerator. So I guess that's something I left off of what I've started. So I started Hillman Accelerator in Cincinnati in 2017, focused on the same group of folks. For us, as we've vetted companies, we've looked for companies that are already in market. So we're not looking for ideation stage companies. We were looking for companies that were trying to figure out product market fit, and maybe we're generating some sort of revenue or had some sort of traction. So for us, yeah, we're not really just going after like bold ideas in someone's head. It's got to actually be out of the head and on paper and in market before we do that. I don't have the luxury of having enough money to invest in companies that are just at ideation stage. So there's all sorts of different types of orgs that do that work. So I think, you know, we see boot camps everywhere. We see incubators all over the place and accelerators. Just depends on the type of org, of whether or not they invest at a super early stage. But for us, we're looking for those things in particular.
Terrific. So Charlie, you mentioned that at various points of your career and perhaps your day, you wear an entrepreneur hat versus an investor hat. We'll ask you to put the early stage investor hat on here. What do you look for at a seed stage? What do you want to see in a founding team?
Yeah, Todd, you know, I think it starts with, and everybody has their perspectives, right? But for me, I'm really looking for a group of insane performers, meaning in a good way, that they are scrappy, they are edgy, they work really, really hard, harder than anybody else to achieve the results. I think, you know, in general, I mean, that defines an A player. When you think of how do you get an A on a test or a paper or a grade, it's 93% or higher, right? So just do the math. Ask yourself, is the team that I see in front of me, the individuals on that team, can each one of them operate 93% better than their peers? And in the role that they're going to play. Are they faster? Or they have a better track record? Whatever they did, maybe it's not exactly what the new startup is, but show me that you have that experience of being an A player consistently. You know, I think another key component, and this really gets into the mix of the team, is specialized intelligence. Having people that really know their area within the business. So having someone that understands obviously the customers and the market and what's important and where some of the competitors may be focusing and where you may not want to focus, but also having people on the product side that are specialized and understand how to build a product, get it to market on time, engineers that understand how to build something that's novel and that works. And lastly, I'd tell you is just, I think you just try to look for commitment. And again, we all have these life experiences. I'm the son of an immigrant, and you know the stories I always heard is there was no failing. That was not an option. Not that it can't happen, but it is just outside the realm of possibility. And you know, I think that's something that you know, I'm always looking for in terms of that just scrappy, gotta get it done attitude.
Great. So Marcy, as the social scientist among us, how can we take some of the guesswork out of evaluating people?
So that's like the $64,000 question, Todd, because, you know, if I had the answer to that, I'd be doing a whole lot more and making way more money if I could give you a quick answer to that. But I do think there are a couple of really important indicators of how to take the guesswork out. One is, and I think a number of panelists have referenced this both in the first part and then even Charlie just referenced it, is what do people do? Like, we need to look at behaviors and what is it that people are demonstrating in terms of their performance, because the best predictor of future performance is past performance. And we've got to appreciate that someone can sound really good and they can have these big, bold ideas, but that's actually what I would say you have to be really careful about, is negotiating between the confidence and the overconfidence. Being really careful about the big, bold idea and the delusional thinker who can sway you on their charisma, and yet they actually can't prove, if you will, demonstrated success. So I think in many respects, it's looking past that first maybe captivating engagement where they overwhelm you with their enthusiasm and their confidence to look into, you know, how humble is this person? I think, you know, the best producers of change are those who have a blend of confidence and humility. They also have a way of being able to demonstrate their competence and their knowledge alongside a willingness to learn and grow. So identifying those characteristics of an individual rather than trying to guess what is this person's character, it's really looking at what have they done, who have they been with. I think looking at the company that people keep is another really important indicator to what someone is like and how they maybe do or don't follow through on those big ideas.
Perfect. So Candice, we've talked about a number of skills and traits that we can look for in entrepreneurs. What's most important to you, and how do you go about assessing them in your initial conversations with founders and entrepreneurs?
We take a slightly different approach to things. So as I said, I run an accelerator as well. We spend a lot of time with our founders. Now, pre-COVID, we ran a 1-week boot camp where we brought 10 entrepreneurs into a house for a week, and we got to know them on a personal level, and their businesses we took a very deep dive into. So 5 days in a house, breakfast, lunch, and dinner together as we vet companies. It's crazy, but it works. And for us, we really get to know folks that way. Post-COVID, that doesn't really work for us. So we're spending a lot of time on Zoom. And we're looking for, we're just looking for amazing founders that are willing to run through a brick wall to do that work. There are some signals that lots of people use. Some of those are Ivy League schools, some of those are other things, but I'm looking for a founder who has subject matter expertise, that is willing and able to build a team around herself that, can get past the finish line. I love a second-time founder, even if that person has failed, because they've learned a lot in that arena. And you can learn over the course of months whether or not someone is coachable, and whether or not they have an ability to take the things that you're saying or the people around, not just us, and execute on those goals. We took some time to make an investment into a company, and what we learned through COVID was that they were able to pivot. And then we were able to make an investment. How do you go from running a really standard company that has nothing to do with selling, PPE equipment, to suddenly selling $300,000 worth of PPE equipment a month just to get it going? That's the kind of founder I'm looking for. One who's going to get the company to keep going no matter what, and making through each of those brick walls that are built around them.
Great. And I'm guessing that, Candice, your kind of in-depth, unique, elbow-to-elbow experience in the house probably does just as much good after you've made the investment versus assessing them up front to really get to know the people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, unfortunately, the demographics of people that we invest in, they don't have a network of people around them to help, right? So lots of Black founders, lots of women founders just don't have a great network. So we want to be that network of people that they trust. And And so really there is no other way for us to make a big impact. Now, we're not a social impact fund, but we are impacting the nationwide landscape of this particular demographic. So no, I think it's important for us to know those folks. I think that all investors have great relationships with the folks that are in their portfolio. And we just do it in a slightly different way. It just has a little bit more of a family feel.
Great. So Charlie, to what extent are you evaluating the CEOs and founding teams for their ability to hit these near-term milestones, right? To stay alive, to raise money, to get to the next level, versus somebody who can sit in that seat and be part of the process for the longer term?
Yeah, Todd, that's a great question. And, Candice's comment about getting across the finish line just inspired me to maybe do a little improv here as it relates to using an analogy. Those that know me, I love analogies. I love Formula One race car driving, right? It really the management of the team. And if you think about a successful CEO, it's someone who has a lot of those same similarities. If you watch Formula One, it is a top performers. They invite top performers and bring them into the organizations, whether it's the drivers or the pit crew, whoever it is. These are teams that are the best of the best. There's a lot of money at stake, right? It costs a lot to run a team, hundreds of millions of dollars a year. You've got, startups burn through that sometimes. And you've got, danger. You've got things along the way where you make a mistake. Speaking to Marcy's point about humility, you can be taught humility really fast in those situations. I think another thing about Formula One and tying it to strong leadership is knowing when to pit. In Formula One, in some cases, a 2-pit race beats a 1-pit race. Doesn't seem to make sense, but you've got to give your teams a time to step back and understand, are we still doing the things that are going to move the business forward? They're going to create customers that absolutely love what we're doing, not just necessarily hit a arbitrary milestone. Milestones matter, but sometimes they can be arbitrary as you get further down the road. So I think all of these things are really important that people understand how to manage their resources, how to manage and take rest from time to time, how to step back, slow down so you can go fast. I think all these things are really important. And I tend to sort of look for someone who, when you're thinking about the long term, they're also thinking about, okay, to get there, we've got to preserve all the great things and manage all the great things in the company to get us where we need to be and cross that finish line.
Okay. That's a great analogy. And I might just add that a little bit like racing as an entrepreneur, often the CEO or original founder gets the credit and they're put out there as this kind of one person force, but in reality, the team behind that person is everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Marcy, with that and with your behavioral ninja skills here, to the question I teed up earlier, what is really able to be determined on a blink basis, right? Pattern recognition based on things we've seen and understood versus Moneyball, deep dive, evaluation, follow the data.
So I would propose, actually, it's not a versus, it's an and. So you need the blink and you need the Moneyball, because people are complex and a singular person is complex. When you put a person with another person, it's not an additive difference, it's an exponential difference. So then when you start talking about building a team, then complexity kicks in. So there is no one single answer that I can give you, and I appreciate the behavioral ninja. I maybe will add that to my resume because I kind of like that. But in many respects, Todd, I think about this from the perspective of emotional intelligence. And earlier one of the panelists talked about the soft skills and the hard skills. I will confess I have a nerve that gets tweaked when I hear the phrase soft skill, because I want anyone on this call or who's listening to tell me what's harder than managing people. That's a power skill. And so emotional intelligence is one of those ways in which you find the and with blink those quick judgments, if you will, those instinctual responses, because that's stuff that we build over time, along with the Moneyball approach of how do we assess knowing the data that's out there. And really, we have to think about the lenses that we use. You know, we have to think about ourselves, and when do I know, to use Charlie's analogy, when do I need a pit stop for myself? That's self-awareness. And your ability to manage yourself and know yourself is part of what is essential in developing your own behavioral ninja skills. It's not just how you interact with others and how you know others. That's the other awareness that's so critical. It starts with knowing yourself. So I even think about that image that you shared at the beginning, the cognitive biases. You know, there are tremendous cognitive biases that play out in how we interact with each other and how we know what to do, but there are also interpersonal biases. And so developing awareness around assumptions that we're making and how does that impact the way that I'm presenting myself, or how do I interact with others? This is all part of why it's so complex. So I think it's Blink and Moneyball, and blend in the emotional intelligence piece, and you start to get at how do you negotiate these complicated relationships at really critical times of business development.
Excellent. And then, you know, picking that up, Candice, because these relationships are just that, relationships, how important is it to you to like the founder, to feel like they're a good person, like you can relate to them, and that, you know, they pass, whether it's the airport test, somebody you feel good about getting in their corner with, however you want to describe that. I think we all intuitively have a sense of what that is. How does that weigh as you evaluate this?
Oh, we definitely need to like each other. It's a definite need. And I mean, I think you also fall in and out of like with people. It happens just like family. They screw up and you've just got to figure out how you pick things up. Yeah, for us, we realize that it's a multi-year relationship that we're creating with these founders, and that someone on the team needs to own that relationship. But it's super important that communication works and is key, and you've got ways to kind of deal with things. It depends on also the type of investor you are. So some folks are just super hands-off, others are not. We're, you know, a seed stage funder, so we like to help folks get to the next stage. I'm sure we won't be helpful at series B and C, but we are, you know, up until this point. So I think it's important to really to like and be able to have normal conversations with folks.
Great. And so, Marcy, it is hard to evaluate people. We've covered that frontwards and backwards, and it's even harder in a Zoom environment where you can't sit face to face. You don't get the full view. The notion of staring at a screen is not the same thing as making eye contact and just kind of building that trust together. And for many of us, it's tempting to lean more on formal tools and assessments. The Myers-Briggs of the world and the other 20 different assessments. Help us understand the value of those, what they do and what they don't do.
So love that question, Todd. And again, it may surprise you to know I'm actually currently editing a volume on leadership tools and assessments. And so it's a really timely topic for me. I can't even tell you the number of tools that are out there. And so to say that there are a few out there to choose from is a dramatic understatement. I think one of the most important aspects of determining whether you want to use some kind of an inventory or assessment is to be clear on what you're trying to learn about someone, and then how reliable and valid. So I hate to use my socially scientific terms, but they're actually really important when we start looking at these formal assessment tools, is you want to make sure that what you want to measure is actually being measured by the tool. So there are some really common tools that are used that actually aren't as reliable and valid, meaning they don't tell you what you want to know with the consistency that you want. But they're common, and so people fall into the trap of using those. The other trap that people will often fall into is that they'll choose to use an assessment for a purpose that it was not created for. So for instance, a very common assessment that companies use is called the Strengths Finder instrument. It's from the Gallup organization. It's a fantastic tool, and it can be used in lots of different ways. And in fact, it'd be really appropriate to use in a small team environment or in a leadership team environment. I use it. It's got tremendous reliability and validity. But people will use it for selection purposes. Like, do I want to hire this person? You know, the first panel talked a lot about cultural fit. And people will misuse that tool because what they're trying to find is the right fit for an individual within a team that they may be joining. Well, that's the misuse of a tool. So I can't tell you the specifics about a particular tool. That wouldn't really be appropriate in this call, but what I can say is there are some really powerful tools out there. And if you want to use them, I really encourage you to consider, what are you trying to assess or evaluate? Make sure that you've got the data that justifies the use of that tool, and that you use it according to how it was created or what it was created for.
Terrific. And so, Charlie, I'll ask you the last question of the panel. So no pressure to bring this thing home in a really coherent, structured, thoughtful way. We're sure you'll do it for us here. But despite everything we've talked about, half of these companies fail, right? Despite people like us putting time, energy, and capital in, they're just not all going to work. And sometimes it's exogenous factors. Sometimes it is the team, right? It is just the team. So in retrospect, sometimes it's things we really wish we would have seen coming. So what do you take away from those situations, which surely, like us, you've seen as well? What do you learn from those failings?
Yeah, Todd, I think a lot of times at least the common thread that I see is where that the organization or the CEO really didn't understand what the North Star was. They thought the North Star was the idea. They were really focused on, instead of being a servant leader, they were a prophet, and they were prophetizing to their customers and their employees, and not recognizing this, I guess, is a component of emotional intelligence, not recognizing that it was falling flat, the message wasn't getting across, or people didn't really agree to the degree necessary to get an order, for instance. So that usually tells you right away, are we getting any kind of revenue? There's a saying that you can be so smart that you could be dumb. And I think every once in a while, and again, this gets back to the several comments about humility, you just have to, in those situations where you've seen failures, is where humility didn't kick in until it was just a little too late. And so I think that awareness is really important, that we recognize that entrepreneurs, the number one thing you have to do is serve the market and serve your customers, and three things you have to do: serve your customers, serve the market, serve your team. And, again, just blindly prophetizing to them is not accomplishing that. So I think that's something that's really tough to identify, and oftentimes it's too late, but that's where, as investors, we need to be able to coach and ask our entrepreneurs and teams, are you really questioning, are you challenging the value, and making sure that you're really bringing it forth?
You saw that the first panel that we had intended was targeted on that pre-seed pre-seed and seed stage company level. And then the second panel is targeted on Series A and beyond. So we're going to start here with Series A and beyond. Again, I welcome Dan, John, and Mark. And let's start with just some brief introductions. Maybe Dan, you can kick us off, just a quick 30 seconds on your background, and then we'll go through to John and Mark.
Happy to do it. Thanks for the intro. I would characterize myself as a recovering entrepreneur. Over 30 years, I've had 4 different companies started, grew, exited, a couple to private equity, couple to strategic fix. One of them was an upside down experience, and you learn a lot from those. I now implement EOS. EOS is the Entrepreneurial Operating System. What is that? Where product market fit exists. It was interesting, the slide that Todd had up earlier from CBI that 42% of the companies that fail are because there was no product fit established. Where that exists, EOS steps in and looks at, hey, how do we improve the execution performances in a measurable way? Investors love it and leadership teams love it because we are all about risk mitigation in the operations. So thanks.
Great. Thank you, Dan. John?
Hi, my name is John Ensign. I'm the president of MRI Software. For those of you who don't know us, MRI is a software company founded here in Cleveland in 1971. So that's got a little age for a software company, but we serve the real estate market. So think of kind of all the back end accounting and property management function for large scale property owners globally. But started my career in sales and operational management, went to law school, so I was a lawyer. So I'll say, Dan, I'm a recovering attorney who's now a business person, and generally spend a lot of time in operational management and a lot of time with our mergers and acquisition group.
Great. Thanks, John. Mark?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Thanks for the intro. Thanks for having me on the panel. Mark Woodka. I'm the CEO of OnShift. This is my fourth startup, third one in Cleveland. First time CEO gig. My past has been leading sales or sales and marketing for early stage technology companies. So we've grown the business to a little over 200 people. I'm a North Coast Venture member, as well as they were an investor in one of our first investors, institutional investors back in 2009. And they've exited on that investment about 2 years ago when we did a recap. So happy to be here.
Great, thanks. So again, I'm just going to work through a handful of questions, and these questions are all focused on that Series A and beyond. We'll go back to the pre-seed and seed stage with Todd's panel, but maybe we'll start with you, Mark. So as you mentioned, you're the CEO of OnShift, and you're now leading a 200 plus person PE funded company, right? And but when you first but when North Coast first invested in OnShift, you had just a handful of people. And you were very much at that seed stage as we just discussed. Maybe you could tell us a little bit at the highest level, how did you get from there to where you are today?
Really hard work. So yeah, when you guys invested, I think we had 4 employees. We were pre-revenue. I think we had 1 customer, maybe 2 customers. So we kind of iterated a lot. So we started out verifying product market fit. That was the most important thing to us. We started landing customers. We started seeing that they stayed with us, right? They didn't churn. And then we slowly, over the years, just ratcheted up the size of customer we went after, et cetera. So in the early days, we went after very small organizations just to prove out the selling model, validate the pricing, et cetera. And then every time we hit an inflection point, we put our foot on the gas. So most of our fundraising over the history of the company was in 2-year increments, where we'd consciously fund the company for about 2 years or until we thought we'd get to the next inflection point. Because when you hit a business inflection point, you hit a valuation inflection point. So a lot of hard work. Team was very, very important, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I've turned over a lot of people on my team more than once. And so it's really having the right people in the business at the right time of the business. Getting to $1 million in revenue is really hard. Getting to 5 is really, really hard. Getting to 20 is really, really, really hard. And if you don't have the right team in place, especially in the 5 to 20, in my experience, the wheels can come off very, very quickly. So it's really paying attention to have the right people on the team that can manage a business that's scaling.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. John, maybe we can jump over to you.
Sure.
I think when you think about MRI over the last 3 years, has it tripled revenues, I think, and basically doubled its headcount through growth and acquisition. So maybe you could talk about what kind of core team you needed to have in place in order to accomplish that.
Yeah, it's been an amazing journey. I mean, the last 3 years have been a lot, but I joined in 2010, and Mark, we had about 200 employees at that time, and we're at about 2,000 now globally, and about 600 of those are here in Cleveland. So a lot of growth over that period of time. And look, I mean, when we talk about core team, I think there are a few things. I mean, we've definitely had some people who have been with us the whole time, like out of that original 200 group. That knowledge that stays with the business, but as Mark says, you've got to be able to move your team, as you grow, and make sure that the right people are there. And for us, I think it's a lot of focus on kind of that hard skill versus the soft skills. I think about the fact that, look, having a team of people that can perform their roles at a high level is table stakes. That's what you need to just function. And then what you got to look for as you grow are some of those softer skills. And we focus a lot on the ability to learn, the ability to adapt to change, because look, growth is change, right? It is inevitable that as you grow, change is happening, and you need a team that can react and not get kind of stuck in a process or a system very quickly and not be able to kind of move out of that. And then, look, there's something that kind of stuck with me. There was a Washington Post article. It's probably 3 or 4 years old now. They did just a quick snippet on a deputy director of the CIA, which I found interesting on his management style. I think his name was David Cohen, and his mantra was "No jerks, no whiners, no peacocks," and it always stuck with me. And I think as you grow and you think about building a culture, I mean, as simplistic as that is, I think building a team of individuals around you that you can just relate to, have a good time, and you're all on the same path is critical. And that cultural experience in building that is one of the things that's really driven us as we've gone through this growth.
Great, thanks, John. Dan, I can tell you enjoyed that.
I wrote that one down. I love that.
And as we heard in your intro, Dan, you've founded, grown, and sold several agency businesses. You're now an EOS implementer, helping others grow their companies, including North Coast Ventures, as we've implemented EOS. Can you just tell us a little bit more about on the agency business side, growing and selling those companies, as well as the role of people in the EOS process?
Yeah. So agency business, we're a professional services orientation. And it was interesting, the comment that Mark made about the first million's hard, the first 5 million's really, really hard. And I can't recall if you said, Mark, that it was really, really, really hard to get to 20. In my experience, and we're all different, right? But in my experience, that first million's really hard. Then it gets to be a little bit easier if you do have templates, tools, process, and you're going in the same direction with vision and clarity, role responsibility. Everybody gets it. Why? Because you've got a little more dry gunpowder. You've got a little bit of breathing room. You've got a little bit of profit margin to now work with. You're out of the woods, right? So it's still hard. Don't get me wrong. It's still really hard, but it's a little bit easier just in my experience with the companies that I had raised. So that was an interesting comment. As far as the EOS, what we do is try as best we can to mitigate risk by giving those processes that are templatized and then customized for every interaction with the vision. Everybody has clarity. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? Who's accountable with transparency for what? How do we measure success for you? Traction. What tools are we implementing? How do I keep score? How did I win the day? How did I win the week? How did I win the month and the quarter, and on it goes? Investors love that. Boards love that, right? Now we can hold each other accountable with clarity. And then health. Health is like the secret sauce, and I've heard culture a couple of different times. Boy, I absolutely, John, love that quote about no jerks, no whiners, no peacocks. I wrote it down. I'm going to use that with your permission.
It wasn't mine. It's all yours.
Yeah, thank you. Health is that secret sauce of culture. Culture, Drucker said, culture will eat strategy for breakfast. Culture is the sustainable competitive advantage in an organization. Culture will overcome the challenges all of us have in an entrepreneurial setting, because we do have them and we will have them, but culture will overcome it. So that right people, right seats, and those intangibles, those soft skills that Mark and John already talked about, so critically important. And what's special is, what is it for this company, this unique situation? It's different for everyone, but we got to define it, and then we got to be able to identify it and articulate it in a way that we know who to attract, who to repel, how to reward, recognize, and if we get everybody in alignment there, our culture will overcome.
Great, thanks, Dan. Mark, maybe we can come back around to you, and for a moment we could rewind the clock and get a little bit more specific and dig in around what it was like to build out your management team layer kind of after that Series A round.
Yeah, so I'm a little bit disappointed I missed something, because it wasn't easy enough for me to get to 20 million. So Dan, I'm following up with you offline, okay? Clearly something's wrong here. So I think what the reality is as entrepreneurs, we have to face the fact that as the business scales, the person you need, let's say at a Series C level, it may be a $20 million revenue to run sales as an example. You can't afford before you get there, and they're not interested in you before you get there, right? They're not going to want to join the organization when you have 5 salespeople. They're going to be there to grow and scale an organization. So I always live about 18 months in the future. And I'm assessing, does my team have the skills to do what they're going to need to do at that level of business? I've had a handful of executives that have been with me the whole time, but I've turned over my sales leadership 4 times, my engineering leadership 5, my customer service 3. And so I think, one of the mantras that I was always taught as a young entrepreneur was hire fast and fire faster. As soon as you think you don't have a fit, you need to make that decision and move on, because you're not doing anything good for that person or for the business. So it's really assessing, are these the right people? Do they have the right skill set? Are they a cultural fit? I agree that culture trumps everything. And if you don't, then you need to make decisions and get the right people, basically in the company.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. John, so, in thinking about the acquisitions MRI has made, right? You guys acquired a number of companies. Can you tell us a little bit more about your approach to specifically assessing individuals and teams as you evaluate those potential acquisition opportunities? I think this is going to kind of give us some interesting perspective on a couple different sides and stages of the sides of the house.
Yeah, and look, I think we've done, gosh, sadly I don't even know the number anymore. Since I've been with MRI, I think 37 acquisitions, but we've done 4 this year. Next week it'll be 5, but we'll talk about that next week. And so look, I think I'll stay with this culture thing. When the first thing we're looking for when we start these conversations is cultural fit. I can't take a company that has not ever looked at itself as a growth company and make that team be a growth company. Like I can't make those kind of metamorphic shifts in businesses that I buy. So I need to see, are we aligned? And that takes a lot of transparency in the diligence phase. It's more than just learning about that company and what they deliver and what the product fit is. All those things are critical, going through the financials and knowing those items. But being really transparent on who we are as a company, how we think, how we operate, how we go to market, and is there alignment between the teams? So that's kind of step one. And then, look, we use all the tools. We have formal assessments, and we do all those things that are all factors of how we look and think about teams. But I think acquisition gives a very interesting and unique snapshot into kind of how people react and deal with stress and pressure. Acquisition by its nature, whether you're buying or selling a company, is a stressful time. And especially for sellers, most people will sell their business once in their lifetime. Others, may be serial entrepreneurs and may do it multiple times, but there are a few people that do it kind of over and over again. So I think you learn a lot watching not just how people go through it, but how they work with their teams, how they engage with you, how do they treat kind of the adversary, or in what can be an adversarial role as you go through that process. And I think watching that and seeing how people go through that, are they courteous, are they kind, are they thoughtful? Those are all things that when people are kind of expressing their true colors in that stressful situation can be really telling. And then that same thing happens during the integration, right? Because acquisition's kind of the easy part of acquisition. Like we always talk about getting to the finish line is getting the deal done, but then the work begins. How do we bring the teams together, the cultures together, the processes, the systems? How do we bring that into kind of one team and one mission from things that are separate and distinct? And that's another aspect where, again, we're really looking for how do people adapt to change? How do they think about it philosophically? And you'll start learning about that. But we're always starting with that cultural integration. And look, if you can't get people aligned on cultural integration, you're never going to get them there when you change out the financial system or the CRM. They won't get their head around it. So I think that whole process and just watching how people engage and think about it is what's been really helpful for us as we've gone through it.
Okay. Thank you, Dan. In addition to thinking about assessing, right, individual ability, maybe you could talk a little bit about other ways to assess a person's ability to function and thrive within a specific team or a specific system. I think John addressed maybe some of that related to his response around an acquisition, but curious as to your perspective on that.
Yeah, I first want to comment just to clarify, Mark, I agree with you. It's insanely difficult to grow a business to any threshold, right? I just wanted to clarify, it gets a little bit easier, just in my experience with the professional services firms, to go from 1 to 5 to 5 to 20. Still insanely hard to do all of them. That's all. To the question about the team dynamic, if I understood or if I interpret the question, versus the individual. So, to me, you got to root it out in part by observation. So I agree with John. How are they treating other individuals? Is there mutual respect? How do they treat the least important person that they're around? How do they treat people that aren't in the environment directly? Can you get any intel or perspective from individuals that perhaps through LinkedIn or their past associates or past employers or professional service providers that work with them? Anything like that? The team dynamic, I think, is rooted in things like, are you willing to suppress personal goal for team good? That's tough for certain entrepreneurs, particularly if this is their baby. This is the first time out of the gate, right? But will they rise to the greater good? There's an example of at least one instance that I'm aware of in one of the North Coast funds that I participated in. I'm in 3 of them, where the founder and the president of an organization has now passed reins to someone who he is technically reporting to on the organizational, the accountability chart. In my mind, that's a leadership trait. I tip my hat to that individual. They recognize they'd hit their limit. And if they're going to a round or the subsequent rounds, maybe they've hit their own ceiling and they recognize it. And so the ultimate team player sacrifice, I'm subordinating my own role in an environment that I started, that I created, right? That's sort of embodies this concept of team. But in terms of trying to root that out, I think it's just asking the peers, the people that they worked with in the past, and then just by personal observation, how are they treating others around them? That's really telling.
All right, thanks, Dan. Mark, as it relates to you and your team, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how the expectations of your investors were different, evolved, changed, however you want to think about it, as you raised from larger funds at more mature stages.
Sure, I'll contrast Series A with Series E. So Series A, value creation is not based on numbers generally, right? So I think we've all seen early stage companies that don't hit their projections, but they're still creating value. And so finding investors that are aligned with that are good. By the time you get to Series E, the private equity world is running their business off a spreadsheet. And if that cell at the end of that spreadsheet has the wrong number in it or it has brackets around it, that's all they're dealing with, right? So you really need to ratchet up the strength of your team to get through that transition. What I used to tell people early in the days is, hey, in the early days, when we're talking about how we create value unassociated to numbers, that's spinnable. I can tell a story around that, right? By the time you get to Series C, it's reportable. Somebody pushes a button and generates a report and there's no hiding anymore. So you really need to have the team that understands the level of scrutiny you're going to get at later stages of financing. And I think private equity is a whole different animal from venture. And it's just a much more intense level of scrutiny. They've seen so much, and they've got analyses that they rarely share with you. But it's very, very interesting how they look at a business so much more differently than a venture capital firm does. So you've got to have the team in place that can stand up to that kind of scrutiny and ideally be ahead of that kind of scrutiny. And that's what we shoot for. We don't want to have things come back to us from our investors. We want to go to them with things. And I need to make sure I've got the team that can do that. That's looking at the business in the right way and very analytically. So we can say, hey, take a look at this. Here's a little bit of an issue we think we have. Have you seen that somewhere else? And can you help us out with that, right? As opposed to them coming to us and saying, hey, we see a problem here. What's going on?
Mm-hmm. Okay. John, maybe for a minute we could kind of flip things around. We've been mostly talking about building teams within these companies and evaluating that talent. But you raised investment capital as well from several different PE funds, right? A lot of all the big funds out there have capital. Cash is cash. But how did you approach evaluating the people sitting on the other side of that table, right, and assess what they might bring to MRI?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I'll start by saying, we currently have 3 private equity firms that are invested in MRI. But, I say it all the time and I mean it, MRI has been lucky to have kind of the right financial sponsor at the right time in our business history. And that's been critical. And so, look, I'd say, for any of this, this is a hard process, and we buy companies, and you know, we will sometimes be in a process to look at a company, and they'll say, well, look, you're the better cultural fit, but gosh, you know, that person's offering me, you know, $1 million more, so it is what it is. And I get it, right? I mean, there is a point where the checkbook talks, and decisions are going to be made financially. But I think it is critical to really understand the fit. And I kind of gave this example earlier from a person perspective, but I think it goes here too. I mean, understand the firm you're dealing with, and whether this is venture or private equity, it really could be the same. You know, how do they view growth? How do they view profitability? Where do they kind of fit on the spectrum versus where your business fits today and where you think your business needs to go? And so that fit is, I think, really important. But there's another layer of that, which I think people get very caught up in the name of the firm. And that's important. But at the end of the day, you have a lead. There's someone who's going to be your main contact that you're going to be spending a lot of time with. And whether that's one person or a team of people, those are the people you really need to get to know on a personal level. Are they the right fit? Are they the right match? Again, this comes back to culture, and it's no different in having the right cultural fit with your financial sponsor than it is in having the right cultural fit on your operating team. It is critical. And you know, as Mark said, I think when you make that leap and you start getting into these deep dive analytics and these conversations about how you're going to run the business, there's got to be that dialogue there where you can still put some context on the numbers and have a conversation about why things are working and not working. There's got to be that level of trust. So I think digging into that is something that's often missed when people are going through a raise of any kind. But I think it's a critical component.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you, John. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Mark. I'm watching the clock here, and I think that we have hit our time for our panel. I mean, just go ahead, and as we've done these virtual sessions in the past, I've told our panelists or presenters, just imagine that thunderous applause, because everyone who's signed in, I'm sure, are clapping in their home offices and living rooms and wherever they're viewing this. But thank you very much. Appreciate it. And at this point, I will turn the reins over to Todd.
Thanks, Daniel. That was a terrific panel. And thank you to Dan, John, and Mark, as well as our earlier panel of Candice, Marcy, and Charlie. Those were some terrific conversations. And on behalf of everyone watching now, I'd like to thank you for participating here tonight. And we'd also like to thank PNC for sponsoring our event tonight and the full Investor Insight series this year. Our next event is Tuesday, October 28th at 5 p.m. We hope to see everyone then. Good night, everyone.